You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to People, Places, Planet. I'm your host, Dara Albrecht, and I'm joined by ELI's own Kristine Perry today to talk about environmental defenders worldwide. We're also going to introduce a new Environmental Law Institute project aimed at addressing the threats they face. Before we continue, be advised that this episode contains sensitive content regarding the violence, threats, and harassment faced by environmental defenders around the world. We will be discussing instances of killings and the dangerous realities that these individuals endure while protecting the environment. Listener discretion is advised. I'm here today with Kristine Perry, a staff attorney at ELI, to talk about environmental defenders and ELI's new platform to protect environmental defenders. Kristine Perry is a staff attorney committed to advancing human rights in the environmental context with a particular focus on gender and disability. She works primarily on international issues with a focus on Latin America. Kristine leads ELI's work on environmental defenders. She has experience in judicial training on deforestation in Colombia, environmental defenders, environmental crimes in Peru, migration with dignity, as well as experience in enforcement issues more broadly. Prior to joining ELI, Kristine worked for Amnesty International, where her work on international human rights focused on the rights of persons with disabilities, gender, policy development, and strategic litigation. She also has experience in refugee and migrants' rights. Her previous work was conducted in the MENA region, Europe, Africa, North America, and Latin America. Kristine holds a JD from The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law and a BA in Spanish and Creative Writing from Denison University. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today, Kristine.
Thank you for having me, Dara.
Just on a first impression, the term environmental defender seems like it could cover a broad umbrella of people. So my first question for you is, what is an environmental defender specifically?
Well, there's no set definition for an environmental defender. The UN Environmental Program defines them as individuals and groups who, in their personal or professional capacity and in a peaceful manner, strive to protect and promote human rights relating to the environment, including water, air, land, flora, and fauna. However, when you think about environmental defenders, I like to think of them under the umbrella of human rights defenders. So that can include a wide array of different types of defenders, including disability rights defenders, children's rights defenders. It really can run the gamut of all different types of defenders, and environmental defenders fit under that umbrella. It doesn't mean that environmental defenders only work on environmental issues. There's a lot of crossover between different human rights. So when we look at environmental defenders, it's not just saying this person only advocates for air, land, flora, and fauna. So when you think about indigenous rights defenders, indigenous peoples, a lot of that is also tied into environmental defenders as well. So, right, there's no set definition, but the UN Environmental Program really does have a good broad definition to say what an environmental defender is.
Got it. So if we think about this under the human rights umbrella, there are lots of different types of human rights defenders who are individuals and groups trying to protect human rights, and environmental defenders are in one of those categories. Are those folks from industry? Are they from the private sector? Do they come from indigenous peoples and local communities? Are they policymakers? Who can be an environmental defender?
So really everyone that you mentioned has the ability to be defined as an environmental defender. It just depends what people are doing. It can be done in an official capacity, so you can be, say, maybe carrying out your duties as a park ranger, and that might classify you as an environmental defender. It can be lawyers, policymakers, or prosecutors and judges that are hearing environmental cases and being threatened or pressured to decide one way may also be considered an environmental defender. Then there are people who don't do it as their official capacity maybe in a volunteer role, things like that. That doesn't mean that they're less of an environmental defender. It really has such a broad definition that we talked about in our previous question, so it really is dependent on the circumstances.
I know you gave me a few examples, but I want to dig into that a little more. How are environmental defenders actually defending? What role are they playing in their local communities or at the regional, national, and international levels?
So there's a wide host of activities that environmental defenders can do to carry out their defense work. It can take on many different forms. For example, writing to their elected representatives, taking part of a protest, disseminating information about a new project that has potential to harm their water source. It can be a park ranger protecting a natural protected area from poachers. It can be protecting an area of land in the Amazon from illegal deforestation. It can be at the international level, it can be at the regional level, it can be at the national level, and it can be at the local level. There's no one spot or slot that environmental defenders can fit in. So when you think of maybe at the international level, you can think of Greta Thunberg, who led the student walkouts for climate change. At the regional level, it might have been advocating for regional agreements, for cross-border cooperation between states. At the national level, it could be calling on change for laws and policies. And at the local level, it might be protecting a local park. When you think of environmental defenders, it doesn't always have to be big, splashy, catching the news to be considered an environmental defender. It can be done at any level.
Coming to the here and now, what is the current state of environmental defenders around the world? Is there any particular region this issue is more pronounced?
Currently, environmental defenders are experiencing great risks. According to Global Witness, 196 environmental defenders were killed in 2023 alone. Over 2,000 have been killed since Global Witness started tracking these numbers in 2012. In 2023, 85% of these murders occurred in Latin America. And that's not to say this is only an issue that's occurring in Latin America, but Latin America is a particularly dangerous region for environmental defenders.
Wow, Christine, those numbers are absolutely staggering, and I can really see that these defenders are particularly threatened. Are there protections already in place for them, or are there more coming into place?
So there are different protection mechanisms. For example, certain countries have rapid response mechanisms. However, when these mechanisms are put in place to protect environmental defenders, we don't always see what we would expect to see. So we might have really great laws on the books, but they're not always implemented or enforced. That's not really contributing to change and helping to protect environmental defenders. Even though they're on the books, it really comes down to implementation of these mechanisms. The Regional Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation, and Justice in Environmental Matters, also known as the Escazú Agreement, which is a relatively new agreement in Latin America, entered into force on Earth Day, April 22nd, 2021. This agreement can add protection for environmental defenders since it guarantees the right to access environmental information and to participate in environmental decision-making. Environmental defenders experience a wide range of threats. For example, they can range from intimidation and harassment to kidnapping and murder. They can also face smear campaigns against them. So this may be done by private industry. This may be stigmatization by the government, criminalization by the government. They're also experiencing, particularly in Latin America, something called a SLAP suit. So SLAP suits stand for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. So let's say an environmental defender has participated in a report calling out a new project that potentially may harm the environment. They may be sued for slander, or if they're taking part in a protest, they may be sued for trespassing. And really, the aim of these types of suits is to tie up the environmental defender's time and resources in court. So while they're fighting the case, they're not really able to carry out their regular activities for their environmental defense. And it's really demoralizing having to go to court for something that's just unjust. Oftentimes, environmental defenders have limited resources, limited time. So this really can hamper their activities and halts the process of what they're trying to carry out. One emblematic example of a threat that environmental defender experienced is a Honduran case, which I'm sure many of the listeners have heard of, but it's the 2016 murder of Berta Cáceres, who was a Honduran indigenous environmental defender, a leader in her community, and her death was related to the building of a hydroelectric project. And this project was without the consent of local indigenous communities or prior consultations with them. Her death really led to a large outcry. The perpetrators were prosecuted and some of them convicted of her death, but that's a very rare situation. Oftentimes these deaths occur and there isn't an investigation. There isn't a prosecution following it. But I did want to mention her because it is such a famous case that I think our listeners will have heard of. And when people think about the threats that environmental defenders are facing, people often think of her.
Kristine, you mentioned earlier that defenders can have lots of different identities, whether that's who they are or their place in society. And then there's also tons of different types of things that you can defend. So maybe LGBTQ plus rights or women's rights, environmental, education, racial justice, indigenous rights, the list goes on. And I imagine some things are maybe more dangerous to defend than others. So thinking about defenders' individual identities and then what they're actually working towards, are there intersectional threats for them?
Yes. So some of these threats really depend on the different identities of the environmental defenders. For example, a rural indigenous defender might experience threats differently than an urban environmental defender. A woman environmental defender may also experience them in a different type of manner. For example, gender-based violence may also play a role in the type of threats that this person is experiencing. So a lot of this comes down to intersecting identities and where the defenders are located, where they're carrying out their activities, and particularly looking at the extractive industry, since that is a particularly dangerous industry for environmental defenders. There's a lot of money behind these types of activities, which really heightens the risks for environmental defenders.
Quickly, before you continue, when you say the extractive industry, what specific activities do you mean?
So the extractive industry, in a nutshell, is taking things out of the ground. This can be exploring or developing. So it doesn't necessarily mean that things are always being taken out of the ground, but it could be looking for things to take out of the ground, which still can have harmful impacts on the environment. So this might be a mining project. For example, gold mining. Looking at Peru specifically, gold mining can be particularly hazardous in the Peruvian Amazon. This is something that ELI has worked on before on small-scale artisanal gold mining and corruption in the supply chain. If our listeners are interested in that, I encourage them to look at some of ELI's resources.
Thanks for the clarification, Kristine, and sorry to interrupt. Please continue.
So looking at the types of activities that are risky for environmental defenders and the intersecting identities, I'm going to situate this in the US, which might help some of our US-based listeners really contextualize it. But looking at the environmental justice movement and environmental racism in the US, it's oftentimes that minorities and communities of colors are overburdened by environmental harms. So they're experiencing threats to their livelihoods, to their health, and they're just being overburdened by these harms. But then they may also experience threats for speaking out about the injustices that they are facing.
I have no doubt that this gets even more complicated when we talk about activities that might technically be legal, but still have harmful effects on local communities or the environment. Take extractive industries like mining or deforestation, like you mentioned. Even if they're legally sanctioned, the damage they cause can still be severe. And reporting that and calling that out can be dangerous for defenders, I assume. But then there's also a darker side, which is the industry of illegal extraction of resources. In Latin America, for instance, a lot of mining and deforestation is done under the table and illegally. Even though the industries aren't technically legal, they are still extremely valuable for those who benefit from those supply chains. And there's still a lot of money involved. There's also a whole other host of issues when it comes to drug cartels, land ownership, power, and violence in Latin America. So I'm sure when there's money involved and things aren't exactly legal either, having whistleblowers or defenders work against the interest of folks who benefit from those activities might make it even more dangerous for people who are already vulnerable.
That's exactly right. And for example, we've seen this in previous work done in Colombia. For example, illegal deforestation and logging. This is oftentimes happening in remote areas, areas that are not heavily surveyed. So it might not come to the attention of authorities immediately. So that kind of leaves a line of defense for the environmental defenders. And that puts them in a very difficult and risky position because there is so much money behind these types of activities and the response time is lagging. So when you think about a remote activity happening in the Colombian Amazon and the nearest town or city is miles and miles away, internet may be spotty at best. There's a definite lag time between identifying a problem and getting help to the problem. So when the information reaches the official channels that the environmental defender is in danger, oftentimes it's already too late. So there is an issue with resources and again, just getting that information in a timely manner so people can assist in protecting environmental defenders as well as protecting environment from illegal activities.
Absolutely. And I think it's imperative that you make that point, Christine, because obviously we're in the digital age, right? This is the era where we're getting out so much information out so quickly to so many people across the world almost instantaneously. And I think sometimes we forget that we still have our limits. A little tidbit about me for our listeners. Part of the reason I'm so interested and invested in this issue is that my own family is from the Peruvian Amazon, and they deal with these problems on the daily. In the town where my family lives, weather patterns and the vastness of the forest makes the road infrastructure unpredictable and often not so great on a daily basis. There may be a landslide, there may be a large infrastructure issue that road authorities can't come out and fix for days at a time. So sometimes it's hard for other authorities to physically get out to these remote areas to deal with the threats, or there may be bigger problems that authorities have to tend to. They may not have the time or resources to make the trip out to respond to one small threat. My mother's town is typically a 14 to 16-hour drive to the nearest major city, and that's considered on the lower end. So I know you've mentioned that these issues are taking place in remote areas. And as we've established, the areas are far and not always well connected. So given that, how do we know that this is happening out there? How can we trust the data?
So we know that these threats exist from a variety of different sources. There are organizations working on the ground, working in community with each other to call attention to the threats that environmental defenders are facing. For example, as I mentioned before, Global Witness is documenting attacks on environmental defenders. And there's a wonderful alliance, the Alliance for Land, Indigenous, and Environmental Defenders, which is a collection of civil society organizations working on these issues from many, many different countries. There are also specific in-country organizations, such as Somos Defensores in Colombia, that work on these issues. Additionally, academics are working on the issues. The statistics and numbers also come from government officials. However, there may be an underreporting issue. So, as we talked about earlier, the definition for what an environmental defender is quite broad, and it's not the same in every single country. So, what a broad definition might classify as an environmental defender may not be classified in a specific country. Also, as we talked about, there are, these cases are happening oftentimes in remote areas, and they might not be reported on. So the organizations working on this are getting the best data possible. They are doing tremendous work, but that doesn't mean that everything is getting picked up. It would be very, very difficult to really know every single thing that happens. It's also extremely dangerous to speak out. It's dangerous to talk to NGOs. It's dangerous to talk to outsiders sometimes about what's happening. It can be dangerous to go to the police. So we do know that underreporting is an issue.
Harassment, threats, even murder. Those actions don't come without consequences. Those are all prosecutable offenses. Are all of those reports being prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law?
No. And a very, very short answer, no. There's a culture of impunity for crimes and attacks against environmental defenders. As you mentioned, these are prosecutable offenses. These are on the books as crimes. However, there's a very low rate of prosecutions against attacks on environmental defenders. As we talked about earlier, it's not an issue about having laws that address this. There are very good laws in the books to help protect environmental defenders. It's an issue of implementation and enforcement. And we'll be talking about that in a minute when we talk more about the project that we've just started at ELI.
That's really interesting. And thinking about the way that people approach these issues, you really do have to put yourself in other people's shoes because a lot of the entities that direct these attacks are large, they have political pull, social influence, and economic importance in many communities. So when you think about the gap in enforcement issues, many of the folks in my communities tend to have the attitude of steering clear, staying out of trouble, and falling in line to avoid risk or harm, rather than come up against these issues and threats head on. Do you think having this view on prosecution and reporting of these threats to defenders is part of the problem when it comes to the enforcement gap?
I think the lack of prosecutions obviously represents a major problem in the system. However, defenders are still taking up their work. They feel such a deep connection to it, and they're still going to carry out their defense work, even though it's risky. However, there's a narrative of victimhood, of hopelessness, and that's something that needs to be combated. Because when you look at these defenders, they're brave. They have real power in what they do, and trying to paint this as a hopeless situation, it's a narrative that we're trying to flip. So when we hear about the deaths and the attacks, we really need to shift it and say, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to prevent this instead of simply saying, this is a problem? Because this is a problem that we need to fix and change.
I really appreciate you honoring the fortitude it takes to stand up in one's community for whatever cause you believe in. And I absolutely agree. Shifting the narrative is so important. And that's where ELI comes in with our platform to protect environmental defenders. So, Kristine, can you tell us a little bit more about the platform? How did y'all develop this idea? When was it developed, and what actually is the platform?
Yes, so this is something I'm really excited about. The platform was born out of many conversations that we had with organizations working on these issues. So civil society organizations, NGOs, on the ground actors, as well as academics, intergovernmental agencies. And so we've had a lot of really good conversations about what ELI can do and what ELI can bring to the table to help address this issue. And something that we're really trying to do is push the narrative forward to help combat this culture of impunity. And so when we're looking at the issue, we are seeing there isn't a lot of data on what happens after a lethal attack on an environmental defender. So we're asking, was there an investigation? Was there a prosecution? Was there a conviction? Did someone serve jail time? Who served jail time? Was it the hired gun person, or was it someone higher up the chain of command who hired the killing of the defender? And when looking at the investigations, were they effective? Or simply was a file opened and then closed with nothing really being done? And so we saw that there's some missing data that, in our conversation, we've heard that it would be very helpful to have what happens after an attack, a lethal attack on a defender. And so that's where the project came out of. So that was really the idea of the platform. We are very appreciative to the Swedish Postcode Foundation for supporting this work. The project officially launched in January 2025, so we really are just getting started. We have a lot of big questions to tackle before we get into building of the actual database, but we're very grateful and we're very excited to start.
Which countries will you be focusing on first?
That's a great question when you mentioned first, because I see this as more of a phase one of a larger project. The first countries that we'll be focusing on are Brazil, Colombia, Honduras, and Mexico. And we selected these countries because most recently, these countries have had the highest number of deaths in Latin America. That's not to say other countries aren't experiencing attack on environmental defenders, but these are the countries that are reporting the highest numbers, and we wanted to focus on them first. There are plans to move to other countries in the region as well as outside of the region, but these are the countries that we'll be focusing on for the first 2 years.
Kristine, this work sounds so interesting, and even beyond the surface level interesting content of the work, I really love that you've framed this as a multi-year project and more of a commitment to protect environmental defenders from our organization rather than just a short-term piece of work. So moving forward, if stakeholders and collaborators want to get involved with this work, how can they?
They can absolutely reach out to me. They can reach out to ELI, and we really see this as a collaborative project. We want to work across sectors with people that care and are connected to this issue. So please, organizations, communities, defenders, academics, government officials, intergovernmental organizations, if you're interested, reach out to me. We really want there to be a large buy-in for this type of work. We want people's voices being represented in what we're doing. And to this end, we are working with in-country partners for each of the 4 countries to really get a sense of what's going on the ground. But if you're listening to this podcast and you think, wow, I really have a value add for this, I really can contribute, I would love to hear from you.
That's fabulous. And if our listeners want to learn more about environmental defenders or the issues they're facing, where can they go to dive deeper on this topic?
Like I mentioned before, there are a lot of really wonderful organizations that are working on these issues. I would recommend checking out Allied, the Alliance for Land, Indigenous, and Environmental Defenders. Global Witness also has a large amount of resources that people can access. And if you're looking for country-specific information from country-specific organizations, I would recommend taking a look around. For example, I'd mentioned Somos Defensores in Colombia. So yes, there are a lot of places people can go to look for information on this.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me to talk about the environmental defenders issue and introduce our ELI project. I'd love to follow up later this year to hear about how it's going and maybe hear from some of our in-country stakeholders. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share?
This has been a wonderful conversation, and I really hope people do follow along with this project and with the resulting database. Designing the database, the methodology, is really what we're going to be focusing on this year. But as we have updates, I would love to share it with the listeners of this podcast, and I'd like to say thank you for having me.
This has been People, Places, Planet, and stay tuned for our next episode.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.